Good afternoon, everyone. This is the lesson for Modules 63 and 64. Module 63, we're going to talk about individual influences on intelligence, like from one person to the next. And Module 64 is another short one, which is going to be talking about group differences, why we have differences between people, different races or genders or ethnicities. So, as with almost everything in psychology, we determine nature and nurture. We determine nature and nurture from twin and adoption studies. In identical twin studies, there are extremely similar scores, IQ scores, of those identical twins, especially when they're raised together. So there they have the same genes, same mental abilities, and same environment. So that doesn't necessarily tell us whether it's nature or nurture. Heritability, if you remember from Chapter 2, is the proportion of variation among individuals that we can attribute to genes. So in adoptive children studies, that's a little bit more telling for us. The genetic influences, not the environmental ones, actually became more apparent as life experience accumulated. So that seems to point to the fact that if adoptive children have more in common IQ-wise with their birth parents than with the parents who raised them, that would suggest nature, a genetic influence on intelligence. And the fact that identical twins have a higher correlation than non-identical twins also points to the nature, the genetic factors. As we can see here, right? So identical twins raised together you should know what these figures are, right? R equals correlation coefficient. They're raised together, it's about a 0.8 something. And if they're raised, so let's just compare this number with this number. Here they're both raised together. Here they're identical, share all the genes. Here they don't. They're not identical. The equivalent of, basically these two are, equivalent of, just any pair of siblings that don't share genes. They have a much lower correlation. But the fact that there's a difference in identical twins raised together versus raised apart shows us that the environment also plays a role. So nature and nurture affect everything in psychology, including IQ. Another nurture influence, this is a heartbreaking story from about 20, 30 years ago. There were a lot of children in Romanian orphanages in Eastern Europe. It was a byproduct of the government's policy. This would never be a ethical study to do, to plan to do. But unfortunately, psychologists had the opportunity to research what happens to infants when they don't have human contact, when they don't have touch, when they're fed, obviously. If they weren't fed, they wouldn't survive. They're fed, they're given water, they're given a place to sleep, but they're not given that emotional connection. That very much affects IQ scores. So that's the nurture, right? That's a nurture effect of delayed development. All right, so now we'll talk about the much more controversial topic of group differences and whether IQ tests are biased. So there are some gender differences and similarities in IQ scores. All of these areas have gender differences, right? As an example, math and spatial abilities, boys tend to do better at. Girls tend to do better in some other areas, some verbal areas. Experience also matters, right? It's not just some of the gender differences may be nature. Some of them also may be nurture. Traditionally in our society, for whatever reason, due to the boys tend to play video games more than girls. Excuse me. Perhaps that explains why boys have better spatial abilities, because video games boost spatial abilities. So for all of these group differences, it's not saying that you put one boy and one girl together, the boy's definitely going to have better spatial ability. We're comparing overall group averages. With ethnicities and different races, different people of different walks of life from different places, here we have to point entirely to environmental differences. Genetically, there is no, contrary to what Hitler believed, and many other people throughout many white supremacists believe this. Contrary to what's been believed by eugenics and people in like Nazi Germany, there is no superior genetics in terms of IQ. On an individual level, yes, some individuals are naturally have a naturally higher IQ than others. But that's on an individual level within every country in the world, right? That's not something that one country over here would have a better IQ than this country over here based on genetics. There are high and low IQ genes spread throughout every country and ethnicity in the world. So why then do we have a gap? Why are IQ scores tend to be higher in America, which would be over here, and Western Europe, and why do they tend to be lower in parts of Africa and parts of Asia? If it's not genetics, the only other option is it's nurture, it's the environment. So there is a high correlation between countries that have between rich and poor, and in terms of money and in terms of IQ. People who are wealthier tend to have higher IQs. Those who are poorer tend to have lower IQs. It all has to do with access to resources and education. It also goes back to Maslow, like we had in the test last week. If you can't focus on, if you're focusing just on eating and drinking to survive, then clearly you're not going to be able to focus on attaining higher education. You have to maintain survival needs first. So we have two troubling trends over the past many years and decades in IQ testing. Racial groups tend to differ in their average intelligence scores, and higher scoring groups and people are more likely to attain high levels of education and income. That's why this is so important. It's not like you would say, well, who cares what a score says? But if we're using those scores to place people in advanced classes or in slower classes, or if we're using those scores to track students, then the tests really matter. And we could be producing a self-fulfilling prophecy of students that are being placed in a lower class, and then they have lower education, and that may then cause the lower intelligence, not the other way around. So let's look at these two scores. The higher scoring group over here, let me change the color, right? Let's say here, this blue group here is a higher scoring group. Let's say that is Caucasian Americans, right? Americans of white or European backgrounds. Let's say the yellow score here is, African Americans. Unfortunately, this is the trend. This probably is what this score is referring to. Now, of course, that does not mean that white students are superior in any way to black students. So why are we getting different scores? There's a couple of reasons why that may be. The test may detect group differences in cultural experience. We spoke about this a little bit in class. To use an example on what's more relatable to us that could be biased against us as New Yorkers, regardless of our race, if we took a test and all the items had to do with used farming as a reference, right? It could be just a regular random math word problem that uses farming equipment and terms related to farming as a reference. Students in Nebraska or Kansas, where they farm all the time, would do really well on it, and students here in New York, where we don't understand the reference, would do poorly. So that could be the case here as well. Even within a same geographic area, we have different cultures, or different cultural references, there's different holidays, right? This is the holiday season, but why is this the holiday season? In other countries, this is not the holiday season where there's no Judeo-Christian focus. So if you ask questions that every question is biased, if you ask a question that presumes knowledge or background in a particular culture, those who do not have backgrounds in that culture will not do as well. So validity is a topic we've been discussing a lot over the last couple of days. Validity, a test, you can't just say a test has validity or doesn't have validity. Tests need to have validity for each individual group. A test, that test I just mentioned about farming, right? A test that uses farming references might have validity when it comes to students in Kansas and might not have validity when it comes to students here in New York. So same thing for race, for gender. That's why it's so important. The SAT has been shown, the SATs that we take, that we know all too well at this point in our lives, has been shown to be equally predictive, have equal predictive validity for both black students and white students. Now, that doesn't mean that black and white students perform equally well. Unfortunately, there still is a discrepancy in results, but that discrepancy we would not attribute to the test being biased. That discrepancy we might attribute to some other society or cultural biases. The fact that maybe black students are, through subtle or inadvertent racism, might be placed in lower classes or treated as less intelligent by teachers their whole lives, and that may have then made them doubt themselves or not give them as many opportunities. But once they reach 11th, 12th grade and they take the SAT, this particular test has been equally predictive of college performance for blacks and whites. However, the SAT might not be predictive of performance for Native Alaskans who have no exposure to the kind of culture or the type of technology that we have. So how do we determine if a test is biased? Here's a helpful flow chart. You give the test to different groups. Do the scores differ? If the scores do not differ, then stop right there. There's no bias. If the average score for different races is the same, there's no bias. If the scores do differ, then there might be bias, right? Here, at this point, we're still at maybe, and we need to ask more questions. Does the test lack validity for one of the groups? If the answer is no, the test is not biased, but like we just said, performance may be impacted by other cultural factors, or by poverty, or by access to resources, or by systemic racism in a given society. That's not the test's fault, that's the fault of society at large. So it's still biased against a certain race or group. However, if a test lacks validity for one of the groups, then the test itself is biased and should not be used for that group. We're going to discuss this a lot more in our class activities on Thursday, Friday, and next week. Hope you enjoyed. I will see you all tomorrow.